If I said to you Porsche Boxster, three things will usually pop into people's heads. Not a proper Porsche, a hairdresser's car, and also you couldn't afford a 911. But I could not disagree more. The Porsche Boxster, if anything, is Porsche's most important creation. Let's begin with, admittedly, my last point. You only bought a Boxster if you couldn't afford a Porsche 911. And people think that this is the first Porsche that was cut priced. Not particularly. Porsche has been doing this since the mid-1960s and started with the Porsche 912. The Porsche 912 was the entry point into Porsche ownership. In 1964, the 911 came along with a 2-litre flat 6, and in 1965, the 912 came along with a 1.6-litre flat 4. This lasted up until 1969, when Porsche had introduced a joint concept or a joint venture with Volkswagen, the Porsche 914. It was designed to be a 2-seater, mid-engined roadster, and actually lower than a 911 to increase its handling prowess. The 914 had two engine configurations. You get a 1.7-litre flat 4 originally, and also the 914-6, which was Porsche's own flat 6 at the time. The 914 was not fast, 13 seconds to 60 in its stock 4-cylinder configuration. However, because of the fact that it was mid-engined and lower, its handling more than made up for its grunt, or lack thereof. The 914 was a success, but was stopped in 1976 when Porsche had made another joint venture with Volkswagen. Technically. People will know exactly what car I'm talking about here. In 1975, Porsche released the Porsche 924. The story goes is that Volkswagen contacted Porsche to do engineering work, as Porsche was an engineering consulting company that occasionally made its cars, not a car company. Volkswagen couldn't decide whether it was going to be a VW or an Audi, and when they got a new CEO, he said, I needed a sports car like I need another hole in the head. Porsche had already done all of the engineering, VW had already paid for it, but we're just going to scrap the car. Porsche then bought the rights to it and bought the rights to 100,000 2-litre inline-4 engines. That was why people didn't think it was a proper Porsche. It used a non-Porsche original engine, and people thought because it was originally supposed to be a VW or an Audi, it wasn't a proper Porsche. But that ugly duckling later became the Swan. Throughout the 924's 18-year life, they constantly re-engineered the car. They offered turbo versions, they offered better engines, they offered better gearboxes. The most notable thing in 1982 was when they wide-bodied it, gave it a proper Porsche-developed 2.5-litre inline-4 and called it the 944. The 944 admittedly was not an entry-level Porsche, it was above the 924 at that point, but it was still entry-level enough that anyone could really get their hands on them. And they are still adored to this very day. In 1986, Porsche showed that they were still kicking that can down the road. They put the engine from the 944 into the 924 to create the 924S, their new entry-level Porsche, and scrapped the old 2-litre inline-4 when they were running out of their license to make the inline-4 2-litre and get that from VW. The 924S was a better car. It was faster, it was more aerodynamic, and it was more fuel efficient due to the fact it was lighter and it didn't have a wide body. Porsche stopped kicking that can down the road in 1988 and improved on the 944 in 1989 with the S2. With quite a few revisions to the 944, the turbo, the coupe, the convertible, the S2, Porsche were kicking an old can still down the road that had been going on since 1975, and they ceased production of the 944 in 1991. Porsche in 1991, however, did not have the funds to make a revolutionary car, a brand new, built from the ground up designed sports car. They just didn't. With the financial collapse in the 1990s and the late 80s, they couldn't afford it. Porsche sales were down by a massive 50% in the 1990s compared to the 1980s. So they decided to revamp the 944 and make the 968 with a different front end and a 3-litre flat 4. That 3-litre still pushed the car up to 156 miles an hour. It was still a very fast car, but in 1992, when they released it, they were initially going to charge £40,000 for the car. In '92, when Porsche were that desperate and that strapped for cash, with people being that strapped for cash in general, it was never going to work. They ceased production in 1995. Porsche were nearly dead in the water at this point. They could barely afford to keep the lights on, except for the fact people had hope because of one car that was in the pipeline. Porsche were actually working on one thing back in the 1990s, and they showed it off at the Detroit Auto Show in January of 1993, simply because if they were going to go to Geneva like they would have planned, they simply would have gone into bankruptcy. They wouldn't have been able to show the car off. They would have died. And that car was the Boxster. Porsche were given a corner to show their car off because no one believed that this company could make anything again and actually work and be viable. But when they saw the covers come off of the Boxster in 1993 and they saw the heartback to the old Porsche 550 that was so loved that even James Dean bought one and died in it, people adored it. This is why I believe this is such an important car and such a special one to Porsche's history. That little concept car was destined to use a flat 4, mid-engined, just like the Porsche 550. People didn't care. They saw the Boxster and they absolutely adored it and knew that Porsche were not going to sell this car at a stupid markup. People even offered, as soon as they saw the concept car, I don't care what you're going to charge. This is a new car, a beautiful car, an interesting car, and we want it. Porsche had showed off their saviour. That is what kept the lights on. The reason that this concept never came to fruition with a flat 4 is because Porsche was so cash-strapped they couldn't afford to do what they had done previously and make different engines for different cars. So they had made the M96 engine for their 911 under the direction of Toyota when they had seen how Porsche were just losing and wasting money and time and resources by making specific bits for specific cars. Porsche used the M96 that they had for the later Porsche 911 and put a detuned, smaller variation of that into the Boxster. The iconic love it or hate it running egg headlights started with the Porsche Boxster and then made its way to the 996 911. This little car that made the Boxster share all of the components of the later Porsche 911 from the front and even in the interior, exactly the same as the 996 911, is what saved this brand and made them able to make the Cayenne, which then further pushed Porsche's budget out massively to make projects like the Carrera GT, the 911 GT3 RSs, and the 918. Porsches that today simply wouldn't be here if this car hadn't came along. Now, I think I've talked a little bit too much. Let's go and show what it's like. I have plenty I can say about my Porsche Boxster that I don't like. The roof rattles, it's noisy, the wind is very intrusive, it's not as quiet as people made out back in the 1990s. But you know what? That just doesn't matter. When you're out on an open road like I am today, every piece of worry goes away. The car drives phenomenally, the handling is brilliant, the noise is absolutely apoplectically beautiful. It's easy to heel and tow. The gear shift, people say, is a bit too long, but I like that. I like that it's got a GT aspect. It's notchy, it's mechanical. It's not exactly the same as a Mazda MX-5's gearbox, but I don't want it to be a carbon copy of an MX-5's gearbox. It throws brilliantly. It handles better than my old MX-5, and that's probably due to the fact that, like the Porsche 914, this is lower and mid-engined compared to the 911 being higher and rear-engined. It makes the handling aspect of this car absolutely phenomenal. It's planted, it goes around every single corner exactly the way you like it. The passion behind it is just there. This car People say is clinical. Richard Hammond described this car as a scalpel. It is a tool that is finely crafted to do exactly what it does, and does it professionally and does it well. James May bought a 986 2.7 Boxster. He loved them. It was made fun of a little bit by Richard Hammond and Jeremy Clarkson on the show. Later on, however, they expressed the point that the 986 Porsche Boxster is one of the best bargains you can ever have. Don't believe me? Listen.
Yeah. It just does a sort of... No, it makes a great noise. They are incredibly well balanced.
It is hard to think of a better car for 6.5 grand or 6.9 than this.
Yes, the Boxster has a detuned M96, a 2.5 litre instead of the 911's 3.4 that came the year after. 205 horsepower to 290 horsepower of the 911. But being lighter, smaller, more nimble, mid-engined, more agile, they are two very, very different cars. The 986 is not the car that you buy if you couldn't afford a 911, because they are just two different cars. But it still sounds like that. This car was adored and ruled as the saviour of Porsche back in the 1990s. It's only as depreciation and time has gone on that people think that these cars are just the barrier to entry if you can't afford a 911. But enthusiasts like myself and like people that I've met who have £350,000 GT3 RSs will still go and say that the Boxster is the car that you buy if you want the proper daily driver that has the ability to still make you laugh like a schoolboy. Unlike the Jaguar video from 2 weeks ago, I'm not ending on a somber note. It's not that this is a company that's made a bad car or a few bad decisions that's led to a car company that's lost everything. This is a happy note. This is a fantastic car that allowed the company to make everything that we still love. They still make manuals, they still make beautiful cars, they still make internal combustion cars and are fighting for the rights to be able to make them and make them better than they ever have. This car allowed them to do it. Instead of looking back at the Jag and looking back at what they once did, we're looking back at the car that allowed them to continue doing this exact thing and make enthusiast cars that we will all love and respect for generations to come. Thank you guys for watching this. And I hope people take my word on the Boxster, try one out for yourselves, and understand it. You'll be surprised, pleasantly.